Gun control groups win big in the off-year elections. Plus, Everytown looks to force Ruger to follow Glock's lead in redesigning its firearms. All this and more on the news update.
No, the devil's got no hold on me.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the news update. I'm contributing writer Jake Fogleman, joined as always by Reload founder Stephen Gutowski. TheReload.com, of course, is where you can head on over today to sign up for our free weekly newsletter. We'll keep you up to date on all things happening in the world of gun politics and policy. This week, obviously, the big news is that we just had our 2025 off-year elections. And, now that the dust has settled and the votes are counted, wasn't particularly suspenseful in just about any of the races that happened. And I think by and large, the takeaway that you can have is it just generally did not go well for gun rights advocates and the candidates that traditionally they've been associated with, namely in the Republican Party.
Yes. Well, and this is the risk that you face when your issue becomes polarized to the extent that only one party supports what you believe, because parties don't always win, especially in our system, which has become fairly well balanced in terms of each party has, over the last couple of decades, had a really good chance at winning every so often, at least. But anyway, here you had Democrats swamp Republicans in all of these off-year elections, from Maine to New Jersey to Virginia to even out in California. There's a redistricting ballot measure out there that won. Not really as relevant to what we're discussing, but certainly Maine is the top, I think, takeaway for gun rights advocates and people following gun policy generally, because that's where we had an actual direct vote by voters on a gun measure. There was a question 2 up in Maine that dealt with whether the state should adopt a red flag, a so-called red flag law, in addition to what they already had, which was people called a yellow flag law. Obviously, this comes in the wake of the 2023 Lewiston shooting, which was the worst mass shooting in the state's history, where the shooter there had a number of red flags, so to speak, in his background before the shooting took place. Now, as we've covered here at the Reload before, a number of times, he likely could have been either involuntarily committed, which would have, in addition to having him committed to an institution, would have taken away his gun rights, but also likely could have been marked for an emergency, what do they call this? ERPO, which is extreme risk protection order. Yes, sorry, thank you. Extreme risk protection order in Maine to begin with. Like he should have been flagged, and obviously there were some local law enforcement failures in the process of because his family members had already called up and expressed concerns about him, and he'd been hospitalized while in the military. There's a lot going on with the Lewiston shooter, where he likely could have been disarmed under the current laws of Maine. But regardless, this became a political question where gun control advocates said the current process they had in Maine was too difficult to be effective. And obviously gun rights advocates opposed this bill. And actually there was bipartisan opposition, because the governor, Janet Mills, who's a Democrat, and who's currently running for Senate for the nomination in Maine for next year, she opposed this question, in addition to, the NRA and other gun rights groups in the state. And none of that mattered, though, in the end, because voters overwhelmingly voted yes on this red flag. I think it was a 25-point margin here, which is not something we've seen, right, from gun control ballot initiatives in quite a while. we have seen a couple of successful ones of the last decade or so. Oregon 2 years ago, or I guess 3 years ago at this point, it's 2022. They passed a permit to purchase law and magazine ban by a ballot initiative, but they only did it by 1.6% of the vote. And that's in, Oregon, which is a deeper blue state than Maine is, with more gun control already on the books than Maine has. And then, Nevada in 2016 passed a universal background check law by, again, about, I think, it was by a couple of points. And so Maine coming back and passing this by 25 points is pretty wild. The last time you saw that kind of margin on a gun control ballot measure, I think, was California in 2016 when they passed. There's a number of different restrictions, but magazine ban was lowering their magazine restriction was part of it. And so the dynamics obviously being wildly different in Maine from California, I think that makes it all the more impactful that you saw this happen. Now, you don't want to draw too much from a single ballot initiative, but and again, Maine had the specific factor that they had a bad mass shooting between, the last time they voted on a gun control ballot initiative and this one. And this one is, more directly targeted towards what happened in the Maine mass shooting case and Lewiston mass shooting case, because it's a red flag law. And the idea is to try and prevent people like the Lewiston shooter from retaining their firearms when they're going through a mental health emergency. So, you don't want to over generalize outcomes like this, but it is pretty remarkable, I think.
Especially because, like you said, we've covered this for a long time now. People always talk about certain gun control policy measures that tend to pull really, really well. Red flag laws being one of them, but things like universal background checks, where they say, look, 90% of people support this. And then you come to a matter of sending it to the ballot, which is the ultimate poll test, right? Is whether people actually vote for something. And it never gets 90% support, right? And so this is the first time you've actually seen support for a measure get relatively close to what polling would suggest it is. But to your point, there are countervailing factors that you shouldn't draw too sweeping conclusions about. But just to point out that this really does break the mold when it comes to these gun control ballot measures that we've seen over the last 10, 15 years or so.
Absolutely. And to your point about the universal background check, polling versus how it performs at ballot initiatives, beyond, obviously there was the Nevada one that won by a slim margin, but that same year, Maine had a ballot question on the universal background checks. And it lost. And that's another point at how much of a reversal this is. Now, I know 2016 for some of us does not seem like all that long ago, but it is nearly a decade now.
Yeah.
So, there has been quite a bit of time since the last time Maine voters went to the ballot box and decided on a gun control initiative. But when they did last time, there's also the factor here that the supporters massively outspent the opposition. There was about 800,000 to 100,000, so an 8-to-1 ratio in this race. But again, that happened last time too. In the universal background check race, there was the supporters significantly outspent the opposition there, and the opposition still won by a couple of points. And so, yeah, just all of that taken together, the makeup of Maine, this more rural state, which tends to be more resistant to gun restrictions, even if it is a purple state with a Democratic governor and Republican and independent senators. And even with the Democratic governor opposing this red flag ordinance or measure, they still won, and by a lot. Like, it was not close. So I don't know. You can't take too much away from it. There was a pro-gun initiative in Iowa, I believe, last year that won by a significant margin, where they shifted, and it was a pretty in the weeds sort of initiative there too, where it was determining the standard of review for state courts when it comes to gun rights cases. But that one won by a big margin as well. I think the same 60+% of the vote in both of these cases. So you can't generalize too much from these things, but it is the most direct evidence about how gun policy is faring around the country in these off-year elections. The off-year elections are, of course, more limited than what we're going to learn next year in the midterms, but because there's only a handful of states even having contests of a meaningful, like, statewide variety. But oftentimes these off-year elections are seen as bellwethers for what's coming in the midterms, and that makes the outcomes all the more important. And this one in Maine is the most directly tied to gun policy because it was a question about gun policy directly posed to voters. Now, of course, there were two other, I think, major there are two other elections that have major implications as well. Why don't you give us a little bit of a rundown of what happened in New Jersey and Virginia?
I was going to say, yeah, Maine may be the most directly, the direct gauge of gun policy just because it actually is a gun policy question. But the trends were very much the same in the other major races that we're looking for that may not have directly been about guns, but in some ways may even have bigger gun policy implications, in particular in Virginia.
Yes.
And that is, of course, the fact that Democratic candidate Abigail Spanberger overwhelmingly beat current Lieutenant Governor Winsome Earl Sears to become the next governor of the state of Virginia. She's going to be replacing Republican Glenn Youngkin. And then, of course, all the statewide candidates underneath her for lieutenant governor and attorney general won pretty comfortably as well. And, even beyond the statewide candidates, there was even just a romp in the Virginia House of Delegates where 13 Democrats flipped seats in that chamber to basically give it a near super majority for Democrats there. And as we've talked about so often on the show, Virginia has really been, ground zero for just passing an avalanche of gun control bills. They obviously haven't made it into law. As we've talked about, Glenn Youngkin has been on a veto tear over the last couple of years. But now that he will no longer be there and there won't be a Republican there to replace him, I think all eyes will go to Virginia in terms of state gun policy moves going forward. Yeah,
Virginia, the outcome is probably even more interesting than New Jersey. New Jersey, just to sum it up real quick, because I think we spend a little more time talking about Virginia, but New Jersey, the Democrat Mikey Sherrill, I think is how you pronounce it. Apologize if not. Beat the Republican Jack Ciattarelli by a huge margin. Now that one was, I think, surprising for a lot of people just because the polling there, especially if you looked at the aggregators that include a lot of partisan polling, really the polling was way off in that race. Sure, the Democrat won by 13 points, which was a lot of the polling, especially the more Republican lean polling, had it like a toss up race basically, and it didn't turn out that way at all. Now that was a race where you didn't have even in the Republican wasn't even endorsed by the NRA. They had pieces in their magazines that talked about how he was a better fit than the Democrat was, because I think they gave Ciattarelli a B+ rating, even though they didn't endorse him, and they gave Sherrill an F rating, or Shirelli, either way. So still a contrast, but they didn't endorse him. They don't appear to have spent any money in that race, although I think New Jersey was the hardest one to track who was spending what. There was a lot of money spent in the race, but it's unclear to me. I couldn't find any good public reporting on, how much the NRA spent. They didn't announce any ad buys as far as I can tell. Everytown did announce a $500,000 ad buy in that race. So, the total may well have been 500,000 to zero, in that particular race, but doesn't do a lot as far. It basically maintains the status quo in New Jersey, which is they have some of the strictest gun laws in the country. They're likely to continue pushing the boundaries of what gun restrictions can be enacted under the Second Amendment. And they're likely to continue aggressively pursuing gun companies in court, which is another thing New Jersey has been doing now with Glock and with like
SIG as well.
SIG also, but and then like 3D gun or homemade gun parts kit makers. Those sorts of lawsuits have been a big part of New Jersey's gun policy strategy, and so now that is going to change, I think, with the election of Mikey Shirelli. I don't know. Either way, it doesn't appear like there's going to be a major change. So that was really the question in New Jersey was, if you get a Republican governor, maybe you'll have some less aggressive gun policies there. You were unlikely to see a major rollback of their gun control regime, right? So we've had Republican governors in New Jersey before, and hasn't led them to radically transform the state's gun policies. But Virginia, on the other hand, as you mentioned, is likely now to see most of those bills that were passed under Youngkin actually become law, especially because I think there's two big takeaways. One is like just how many seats Democrats picked up. I don't think anyone's surprised based on the polling, although again, the polling I think was a little bit off and made the race a little closer than it actually was. But I don't think anyone's surprised that Democrats won at the top of the ticket, although we'll discuss the attorney general race in a second. But the fact that Democrats flipped 13 seats to expand their majority to 64 seats in a 100-seat House of Delegates is, it's not quite 2/3, but it's getting real close. And that's not something you've seen in Virginia in a long time. Virginia has, over the last several election cycles, flipped back and forth in terms of control, but it's always been by a really thin margin. In fact, I recall it's a couple election cycles ago, the Republicans got the majority through a literal tie-breaking ceremony, which, if I remember right, involved pulling names from a bowl, I think is how they did it at the time. There was,
might as well have been rock, paper, scissors.
Yeah, that may have been for the Senate majority. I can't recall which house it was. I have to look this up, but that is a real thing that happened maybe 10 years ago. I don't know, last time. So it's gone back and forth, and Democrats only had like a 2-vote majority going into this election. And the fact that they're going to have such a huge majority after it is, I think, changes the calculus for gun policy as well, because there was some reason to think, and look, the Senate in Virginia wasn't up, and so Democrats still only control that one by 2 votes, and it won't be up until I think next year or the year after. But Virginia, we do our elections a little weirdly here. Obviously, we're doing this off-year thing with the governor's race in the House, and then the Senate is not always up at the same time at the House. This wave didn't hit the Senate the way it hit the House, but Democrats still control the Senate, and they have pushed all of these bills through the Senate before. So there's some reason to think they might be more hesitant to vote on the same policies, especially things like an assault weapons ban, knowing that the law will actually knowing that the bill will actually become law if they do so. That's always something of a calculus that politicians have to make. It's easier to vote for something if you know it's not going to go and actually lead to political consequences for you by somebody being very mad at you because they lost their ability to buy their favorite gun or something, right? So I don't know that that's enough of a factor to overcome even without the huge shift in the House. But there's some possibility. Obviously, the courts, the gun rights advocates in Virginia have had more success in the courts. They recently got the universal background check law that was passed the last time the Democrats had full control of the state house. That was just enjoined in federal court. So, and they've had a number of other successes recently. So it seems like that's where the fight is going to be in Virginia, because I think when you've got 64 seats in a 100-seat house, and there, I don't know that many of them are very open to hearing from the NRA or a group like the Virginia Citizens Defense League, your legislative lobbying is going to take a big hit. And so, so the main outcome, I think, is surprising win for Democrats and just how overwhelming it was. And that means probably more, a higher degree of likelihood that they're going to push through dozens of new gun restrictions because they were already trying to do that before this happened. And then you have the attorney general race, right? Jay Jones. If you remember, if you want to sum up the scandal there.
Sure. I was say, if you want to talk about a race that maybe was closer to guns, but not for policy reasons, more because Jay Jones, some texts were unearthed pretty close to election season, in which about, I think 3 years ago or so, Jay Jones evidently was, he meant to text someone else, but accidentally texted a Republican lawmaker in the Virginia State Assembly about how he's bemoaning a Republican speaker that was eulogizing a past Democratic lawmaker and joked that he should be shot in the head. And then he was confronted by this Republican lawmaker who said, "I don't find this appropriate. Why are you doing this?" He basically doubled down and evidently called her on the phone and said that, in so many words, I'm paraphrasing a bit because I don't remember just how awful it was, but I said essentially that, he deserves it, one, but two, Republicans need to feel pain so that they can change their policy positions, which may include another, a wife of this lawmaker holding their dead child in her hands so that they can feel pain. And
pretty disturbing
grotesque
stuff.
Yeah, grotesque stuff.
I mean, it's definitely not, basically, my understanding of it, at least from reading those pieces, is I think the National Review was the first to break this. And I think Free Beacon also had some stories on this. But they basically, and this is, if you've been in the online gun debate at all, you've heard this basic argument before that, like, essentially, I hope it's pretty sick stuff. It's stuff you might hear from anonymous account on Twitter about how, well, I hope your kid gets killed so that you change your mind with a gun, so that you change your mind on gun policy. That's essentially what he was saying in those texts. He did apologize for this, of course, but he refused to drop out, and he was unendorsed, I think, by Giffords, if I remember, but
Everytown.
By Everytown, which had already spent, apparently, according to the numbers we looked at, about $200,000 to try and get him
Giffords was the only
elected.
one that stuck by him. They were mum about it, but they kept the endorsement, which is...
And Spanberger didn't unendorse him either, call for him to drop out. So the strategy was to just stick through and hope that the coattails pulled him across, which is exactly what ended up happening, right? He won by about 5 points, whereas Spanberger won by 14 points. So there was quite a lot of ballot splitting in the race that went against Jay Jones, but not enough for him to lose. And honestly, a 5-point victory is fairly comfortable, right? It's not. So even with that last month, the sort of October surprise story of Jay Jones's disturbing texts, he still pulled off a pretty easy victory. And the other thing that's telling about that to me is when you look at the money fight here. Gun control groups dominated, especially Everytown. It's a little hard, it's harder to track these races money wise than like the federal campaigns where you can look at FEC documents and disclosures. But from what we see in the Virginia Public Accessibility Project, I think it's called. NRA in there only they're only marked down for spending about $25,000. Now Everytown is only marked down as spending about $600,000, which includes $200,000 to Jay Jones. And I think the NRA only gave like $5,000 to Miaras, who's the incumbent Republican that was running against him. But those numbers might also, that's a pretty stark contrast to begin with, 600,000 to 25,000. But I think those numbers appear to be lowball estimates because Everytown claims that they spent another $1 million on just the Spanberger ads alone, which I don't see any reason to doubt that happened. And some of the public reporting tends to lag from what groups might announce themselves. The NRA didn't make any announcements like that. And so the numbers that Everytown put out, at least, say that there's about a 55-1 advantage for Everytown over the NRA. There doesn't seem to be any other significant spending from gun rights groups, except for the Virginia Citizens Defense League, which VPAP says spent about $30,000 as well. VPAP's disclosures or VPAP's reporting on this implies that VCDL actually spent more money than the NRA. I don't know if that's true. Everytown actually has the NRA's number a little bit higher than what VPAP has as well. So I did reach out to the NRA, but didn't hear back as far as spending in this regard. But you can make an argument that maybe they calculated that the governor's race and some of these other races were out of reach to begin with. And certainly you can make that argument about the gubernatorial race, because it never, even with the polling being off against Spanberger, it was never really close. But the Jay Jones, obviously there was more of an opportunity there, and the polling even was off again in that race in the other direction. Had Miara's, I think, leading in the end by a point or two. Now, obviously, that wasn't right, but you would think there would be you could try to get some value out of putting money into that race, and it doesn't appear the NRA has really done that. And I would say that it appears that they just don't have the ability to do it, at least through this election cycle, because as we're reporting on the lack of election spending, we also got news announcement from the NRA, and then further reporting from the Washington Post, which you linked to in the newsletter this week, that the NRA is going through another round of layoffs, or furloughs at least, that impact 36 people. And this is after several previous rounds of the group shrinking, and they're even closing down several of their publications. There's only going to be 2 NRA publications going forward, American Rifleman and I think American Hunter was the other one. And so, America's First Freedom, which is the more politics focused one, is going away altogether, it sounds like. I know they furloughed a lot of the staff there, and a lot of the staff at American Rifleman as well, from what I've been told from sources in the NRA. So things are pretty bleak right now. Or, obviously there's a couple ways you can look at it. Maybe it's just part of the reform effort. Reformers now have total control, it seems, of the organization, and they are implementing a rebuilding plan. It's one way to look at this. And they're trying to right the ship in order to be effective in next year's elections. And so this year's elections, I guess, had to be sacrificed to that effort, is one way to look at it. The other way to look at it is they may just be too late to save the place, and that all remains to be seen. But these 2025 elections are a really bad sign of where the NRA is at right now.
Yeah, particularly because sort of the irony of it all is that these races are right in the NRA's backyard. It's right where the NRA is headquartered. So you'd think there'd be an incentive anyways to make a strong showing in the place where your organization is located. But as you mentioned, that may be just a matter of no capacity to do so.
And that's another risk too. That's another potential outcome here, is that I wouldn't be surprised, and we have seen this in the past. Some Virginia Democrats have tried to target the NRA in particular.
Good point. Yeah.
And so there could be some state legislation that tries to go after the NRA.
Or even legal action from an attorney general that might lack certain scruples.
Yes. Jay Jones is now, his character is most certainly in question after this race. And now this person who wished death on his political opponents is going to be the top law enforcement officer in the state of Virginia, which seems like a bad thing. But we are, of course, in a, sadly, I think for me personally, at least, in a sort of post scandal, post accountability, post shame politics. We've been there maybe for the last decade or so, and I think Democrats look at Republicans and think, well, we don't care anymore either. I don't know. It's not. It seems like a bad seems like a bad spiral, bad path we're on with that. I would say. But that's my personal opinion on that one. Anyway, yeah, and so overall, the election was a blowout, and the spending race was a blowout. It wasn't close at all, and the NRA wasn't there, and nobody else came in to pick up the slack. It doesn't, as far as we can tell. I don't see any major spending from the other gun rights groups. What I see, honestly, is more social media activism from the NRA. I have noticed that they've picked up, that thread more significantly over the last couple of months. That they're more active on social media, they seem, than they were maybe 6 or 8 months ago. And so I don't know if that's what the gun rights movement is devolving into, just social media activism. But if it doesn't have these other components of state house lobbying, campaign spending, it's a much weaker movement than it was before.
Absolutely. That's something we'll keep an eye on, like you said, as we look forward to the 2026 midterms, which will be the next big test for whether or not they can get involved in the electoral strength of the gun rights movement. Getting out of some election news, you had an interesting piece about the ongoing fallout, or what looks like it could be the fallout, of Glock's decision to redesign its pistols in what appears to be, we have no confirmation, but certainly the timing makes it look like it was in response to pressure from gun control groups in the form of lawsuits, as well as actual legislation banning Glocks over the purported ease of illegally modifying them into machine guns. Well, now it looks like another prominent gun manufacturer is finding itself under the microscope of gun control activists for the very same reason.
Yeah, and of course, gun control activists, or Everytown in particular, has taken credit for Glock's redesign, and as they were the ones who first filed, were one of the plaintiffs in the first suit filed against Glock over this claim that the internal mechanism of the older generation Glocks, really seems like pretty much all the Glock generations, that anyone that has this cruciform trigger bar, that they're too easy to manipulate into firing full auto with the Glock switch. And they also wrote the bill that California passed in order to try and ban those cruciform trigger bars or any guns with them. And that's how we get from Glock now to Ruger, because Ruger, obviously another major American gun manufacturer, or major gun manufacturer in the world, they make a Glock clone. Essentially, the RXM is effectively a clone of the Gen 3 Glock design, because that design went out of patent a little while back, and so you have a number of companies that make essentially Gen 3 Glocks, just like you have lots of companies that make 1911s. And so Ruger is probably the biggest target of any of these companies that have developed a Glock clone. It did it alongside Magpul, right? And it's a very well-received gun when it came out. It's probably among the most popular handguns that Ruger makes. If I had to venture a guess, we don't have sales numbers necessarily, but I would imagine it's probably one of the more popular ones, because Ruger, frankly, doesn't make a lot of super popular handguns outside of maybe like the LCP line. Their smaller concealed carry lines, but Everytown wants them to do the same thing that Glock did: drop the gun, stop producing it, stop selling it, redesign it. And we don't have any word from Ruger as to what they plan to do, and we haven't seen any lawsuits yet. But I think that's the implied threat here from Everytown, that they're going to sue Ruger over this. Now, Ruger and Glock are in a little bit of a different situation, because Glock was still selling their Gen 3 Glocks in California because they had been grandfathered in before the handgun roster was implemented. So when the California law passed, in addition to several of the lawsuits against Glock making it past early stages of requests for dismissal, they seem to have made a business decision to discontinue that design, since they wouldn't be able to sell it anything in California at that point after the Glock ban, as it's colloquially termed, was passed. Ruger with the RXM doesn't have that aspect of it because they already weren't allowed to sell the RXM in California. And so we'll see what Ruger does. They haven't said anything yet. And these gun companies rarely do comment when we ask them to. In fact, they're very difficult to even contact for comment. They don't have like press lines, most of them. And they haven't said anything publicly since Everytown sent them this letter demanding they stop making this gun. And of course, I think this will probably come to other gun companies soon. Shadow Systems is another company, Zev, another one. Palmetto State Armory's Dagger, I believe, is basically a Glock clone. There's a lot of these on the market because the Glock design is an extremely popular one, right? As we've discussed before. So, it does seem like Everytown will probably just keep pushing this until either these companies refuse to comply and are willing to fight the lawsuits that come, or they all give up on this particular design. And then the question would obviously be from there, is Everytown just going, would they be satisfied if all these Gen 3 style guns went off the market and were replaced with something else? Or will they just move on to the next gun design that they with similar arguments? And actually, we're hoping to have Everytown on the show, a representative from Everytown, to discuss this series of lawsuits and threats. So we'll see if that pans out or not. But I have reached out to Everytown to discuss this on the show, but haven't gotten a concrete answer yet. So we'll see.
Yeah. And in the meantime, like you said, we'll keep an eye on what Ruger decides to do, or if another lawsuit is going to materialize the way they did against Glock. Getting into some of our newsletter links this week, one of them comes to us from Reason Magazine by someone that's actually going to be joining you, Steve, on the interview podcast this week, which will be out for members on Sunday and everyone else on Monday. Not so much about this piece that he wrote, though. This is him covering a lawsuit that the Second Amendment Foundation filed in New Jersey that, at least according to the allegations in the complaint, is a pretty wild story. Evidently, it deals with a New Jersey husband whose wife was having some mental health issues and was getting medical attention for that. And the complaint claims that there was a miscommunication about her potential suicidal intentions, and there's a potential involuntary commitment involved, but they cleared it up. And I guess the hospital later came out and said, oh, no, she wasn't actually suicidal. But nevertheless, that caught the attention of state authorities, who said that the husband had to surrender his firearms as a result of his wife's mental health issues. And after he later tried to go back to the authorities and explain the situation, that it was a misunderstanding, and I'll keep everything locked up, she won't have any access to it, they have evidently refused to give him his guns back in contravention of state law.
Yeah, pretty brazen stuff from the local PD there. Just confiscating someone else's firearms over concerns about their spouse is not something that I think we've seen much of before. I do feel like I've heard of maybe one other case where this has happened before, but yeah, especially if there's no access for the wife to the firearms, then there's the level of concern should be a lot lower here, especially if she isn't actually even suicidal, right? So, but either way, like, it's not, the husband is not the wife, so the justification for confiscating his firearms doesn't seem to be there. And it'll be interesting to see what happens with this suit, because I don't even think there's like a state law, as you mentioned, that would support these actions, even in New Jersey, right? As we just talked about, which has very strict gun laws.
And there's also some documented, correspondence where the husband was emailing state officials to try to clear this up, and he wasn't getting anywhere fast enough. So he kept asking how are things going. And evidently some state officials basically threatened that if he kept pushing this further, they would take his firearms ID, which is the license that New Jersey requires in order for you to own and purchase firearms. And so he's being threatened for even pushing this. And that was before he retained counsel. So I guess those allegations will see their time in court, but certainly pretty wild to see.
Absolutely. And yes, we'll have Jacob Sullum on the interview podcast this week to discuss U.S. v. Himani Supreme Court case about marijuana use and drug gun possession, because he actually has a whole book on this coming up. So good expert to bring on. And of course he wrote a piece for us on this a week or two ago as well. So it's good to have him on the show. I think it's a good episode. People should definitely check that out.
Absolutely. Another story we want to highlight comes to us from the AP. Sort of new details in, several months ago, what we reported on was the incident involving the airmen at the Wyoming Air Force Base, which reignited the whole controversy over the SIG P320 and its military name, the M18. It seemed to be another instance of one of these mysterious negligent discharges that had everyone really concerned about the pistol's internals and whether it was truly safe. Well, now we actually have criminal action being taken against the airmen, multiple airmen involved in that incident, because it sure doesn't seem like this was a case of the gun going off by itself.
It does not. And I think this gets to an important point here about your sources of information. Because I do recall when this first broke, news of this first broke, there were a lot of rumors out there about what had happened. And people were very sure, based off of those rumors from anonymous sourcing, passed through without any, vetting from any sort of reporters or anyone else who was willing to put their name to stuff, right? That this definitely was a case of the SIG 320 design going off on its own. And not to say that this clears up all of the concerns around the P320. We've obviously reported on numerous other incidents beyond this one, but this was kind of treated almost immediately as absolute proof that the design is defective, and then it got somebody killed, when we didn't know the facts and what the Air Force was saying. Again, a lot of not definitive statements from the Air Force on this one. There were a lot of implications there, and that continued as well later on when they did arrest this airman and didn't say definitively what they're accusing him of doing, but the charge list implied exactly this outcome, which is that he basically shot this guy. It sounds like perhaps, or he shot his fellow airman. It sounds like perhaps accidentally or unintentionally, but also negligently. Like he pointed the gun at him intentionally as a joke. Apparently, at least that's the story that is coming out of this reporting now. And the gun fired, or more likely he fired the gun, perhaps unintentionally, and killed the airman, and then apparently coaxed two other airmen into lying for him about what had happened. And that's where this initial story that the gun went off on its own came from, because these three airmen apparently made it up, because they've now pled guilty to this. And so, there's some major takeaways there about, one, being cautious with early reporting, especially rumors on this stuff. And but even when the Air Force first came out and the actions they took at the time, when they were making official statements and pulling the gun from service, implied that that's what had happened. But again, even with the implications, you got to be cautious about these things. You have to be, until there's confirmation. And now we have what is effectively a completely different story from what it first sounded like. And that appears to have been intentional on the part of the airman who killed his fellow service member. And so it's important to be skeptical and to vet these things when they happen, right? Then that's why we were always in our reporting, trying to follow up and get official word from the Air Force. We filed a number of FOIAs. They actually stonewalled us on a bunch of those FOIAs. Wouldn't give us the information requested several times. I'm still going through and attempting to appeal some of those FOIAs, but that's where you have to hold the evidence to a certain standard of accountability. Like you have to have certainty before you can report things being 100% true. There's a lot of this was murky to begin with, and we treated it that way, but a lot of other people didn't. And so I think that's just shows you the importance of having good standards when you're reporting on things like this. But yes, so in the end, it does appear that this was not an incident where the P320 or M18 was at fault. It appears this was an incident where an airman perhaps did not intend to shoot his fellow service member, but certainly was highly negligent and ended up killing them by shooting them. So, but I think that's all we've got for this week. You got any fun plans this weekend, Jake?
Kind of mourning and celebrating my Denver Broncos, who I don't know if everyone
Yes,
watched
they won
Thursday
by
Night Football.
3 points in a blowout victory against the Raiders.
We're 8-2. We have the best record in the NFL.
That is true, though. It doesn't matter how you win.
Every
as
week.
an Eagles fan, I'll say it doesn't matter how you win as long as you continue to win.
Yeah. That's what we keep telling ourselves, but boy, is it tough to watch some weeks.
And it was, to be fair, too, it is Thursday Night Football, which is always usually a bit of a mess.
It's always bad, yeah.
Just be glad that you got out of it with a win, because there's no guarantee of that in the NFL. So, right. But yes, a 3-point win over the Raiders in 2025, not the most impressive thing you could have done, but 8-2 is pretty impressive.
That's right. That's what I'm sticking to.
And you're better off than Mike over on the Active Self-Protection podcast that I do, the Gutowski Files, as he calls them. He's a Commanders fan, so you could do much worse than just beating the Raiders by 3.
That's true.
Bo Nix's arm could be ripped off like Jaden Daniels was for no reason at the end of a blowout game that he shouldn't have been in.
Absolutely no need for that to happen. Yeah.
So, count yourself lucky. We don't play till Monday against the Packers, but we did just reload. We had a really good week despite not playing at all. So that's always nice. Best week in the NFC East for sure, despite not playing. Everyone else lost, and the Commanders maybe lost their franchise quarterback. I don't know. Hopefully not. I hope he comes back. You don't want to see a guy go out like that, but it was his non-throwing arm, I guess. So maybe he'll make a full recovery, hopefully sooner than later. But either way, if Eagles got better, they traded for another Jalen. So the more Jalens seems to be the theory here, is you can get as many Jalens as possible, you'll win the Super Bowl back-to-back years. I hope that pays off. We'll see. But we don't play till Monday. So this weekend will be my first normal weekend, I think, since the wedding. Because we still have my sister-in-law was here for the week after the wedding, and so it'll be nice to relax with my wife and just enjoy, probably doing a bunch more unpacking and stuff like that too, because we got all the stuff to redo the apartment and whatnot. But a nice slower pace perhaps this weekend. Hopefully, we'll see. Maybe hopefully it won't be huge news that breaks. That's always a possibility too. But if there is, we will be there and we will cover it. I promise you that. So, but that's all we've got for you guys this week. We will see you again real soon.